Welcome to this video. Today, I'm going to try to tell you why, oh why, do I paint the way that I paint. If you've seen any of my videos, you know that I essentially finish as I go. Meaning I start in an area, like this eye here, I try to make it as perfect as I possibly can. Move to the next area, finish it, and continue that pattern until I cover the whole surface. Now, of course, I do go back and revise, and I also begin the painting process after doing a complete drawing on paper, transferring that, reinforcing that transfer, and an underpainting. But once I begin painting that form pass, I essentially try to finish as I go. And that's really what you see in most of my videos. And the question is, why do I do that? What's the reason? What is the background there? What are the advantages to working like this? And what are the disadvantages? Because any painting method has disadvantages. And I think by talking about them in this video, I can help give you ideas to offset those issues if you in fact want to try working in this process. Also, I want to kind of separate out the process, this process you see me do where I essentially finish as I go, from the ideas or the concepts I think about when I work. It's kind of like anatomy. When you do a drawing, you can work in a lot of different styles, but anatomy is still anatomy. So you might draw in one particular style versus another, but the clavicle remains the clavicle, the skull remains the skull, regardless of whatever style you're working in or whatever process you're following. So the same is true for the color concepts, the form concepts, the light concepts and structure, so on and so forth, that I think about as I work, which has a big influence on the outcome, and so does that process. But by sort of recognizing the difference, you can kind of pick and choose what you want to take from my videos and put into your own work. Now, the first part of this conversation actually comes down to you. And it's a question you have to kind of ask yourself. And it's a little bit of a tricky question, but you want to figure out, or when you're trying to figure out how it is you paint or the process that you want to follow, it sort of begins in an introspective manner. And to explain this, I'll give you a little bit of a personal anecdote or story about how I came to work in this method and learn how it is I best problem solve with paint. When I was young, when I was in high school, I was trying to paint. I grew up in a household with art all around me. My mother had gone to art school. She was a graphic designer. She didn't really teach me how to do realism, but she introduced me to oil paint, and I myself wanted to learn how to do it. And bear in mind, I'm old, so I went to high school in the 90s, and we didn't have YouTube. We didn't really have a lot of art videos. There were VHS sort of art videos in the back of catalogs or magazines, and they weren't particularly informative. By the time I finally got my hands on one, it was something of a letdown. I've talked about that before. But the point is that there wasn't a lot of information. So anything I tried at that point in time was just what I thought you should do, right? And so when I was in high school, I remember I was trying to do paintings, copies of Velázquez paintings from a Velázquez book I had. I was trying to copy Norman Rockwell paintings. And everything I did was really, really bad. Okay, so really, put it in perspective here. But what's interesting is that even at that time, I was trying to finish as I went along. So I would start on this nose on a Norman Rockwell painting, try to paint it, finish it, move to the eye, move to the cheek. Again, I didn't know what I was doing, but I was still just intuitively working in this very sequential way and trying to finish the things as I went along. Now that's very telling because it suggested to me later on when I was looking for, I guess, some sense that I was on the right path, that on an intuitive level, this was just how I problem solved. Even when I was totally naive, had no information, I just naturally worked this way. And I eventually went to college. I went to Florida State University, and just, the minimal art instruction I got there consisted of people telling me that I should never work in the way that I was inclined to work. You should never finish as you go or work in little areas. You want to work all over at once. I think a lot of us got that feedback from some art teachers somewhere. It got reinforced when I went to the Florence Academy, where they essentially kind of worked all over at once. They worked like large shapes, sort of optical, and kind of slowly worked towards more detail. Nothing wrong with that. Many people come out of that And that's really something that connects with them. That's how they problem solve, and they make amazing paintings, obviously. But for me, it was uncomfortable because it wasn't the right fit. And just coincidentally, or, fortuitously, at the same time, I became aware of other artists, Jacob Collins, Douglas Flood, people who were working in the way you see me work now, who essentially taught me this technique in a formal way. And so for me, it was a little bit like coming home, because I was like, this is the thing that I connect with. This is how I problem solve. And the other part of that, and I think this is also an important feature of how you decide the way in which you work, is I loved their work so much. So not only was it a way that felt natural to me, the results they were getting in their work were my favorite, right? What I liked, me personally, liked most. Now, something I benefit a lot from, or one of the real advantages, I think, to working in this way, is sort of psychological. For me, if I go in and I start an area that is relatively small, let's say an eye, and it has these little discrete forms like the brow, the eyelid, I am much less overwhelmed than if I look at the whole head and I think, my God, I have to paint this whole thing. Now, you could simplify that by saying, I'm just going to do large shapes, simple tones, fair enough. For me, knowing the level of finish I want to achieve, the fact that I am so fascinated by form and love the experience of sculpting form, doing it in smaller areas on smaller forms is actually less intimidating. So if you're intimidated by this process, if you find it sort of daunting, think about it from that point of view. That if you go in and you say, instead of thinking about all of it, or all these things I have to do, I can think about this brow form that's relatively small, this eyelid form that's even smaller, this eyeball, this tear duct, these little small discrete forms. I can kind of put myself into this little environment, this little world, and have those little discrete goals. They get complicated fast. Of course, you have to relate them one into the other. But it's actually simpler for me, and I get excited. I get invested in it emotionally, and my confidence builds, and I can move on to the next series of forms and sort of extrapolate out from there. And that idea of extrapolating out from whatever it is you paint, I think is really key. And it kind of relates to something that many people often think is a problem with this method, which we'll come back to, but may in some ways, or in many ways, also be a strength. And it's not really how this process is looked at very often, but for me, I think it's really a big part of it. And that is, when I work on an area like this, for example, these forms of the eye have gradations, they have full ranges, right? So any one of the brows, brow forms, point towards the light. The sclera, the white of the eye, points towards the light, the eyelid, so on and so forth. And each of them are very round, small little forms in turn, have full turns into shadow. And as such, they have relatively full value ranges. Each one of them is a little bit different, has different parts of the form oriented in different ways, interlocking in different ways. And conveniently enough, on the eye, one of the reasons I really love it, you have different local values. You have the eyebrow, which whatever their hair color is going to be a certain value. You have their flesh tone, that's going to be a certain value, hue, and chroma range. Eyelashes, iris, the sclera, the white of the eye, the parts of the eyelid, the tear duct. All of these things are going to have their own little value ranges. Some of them will get quite dark, like the pupil, the eyelashes. And because, again, each of these little forms are very round and have full value ranges in relationship to the light source, you end up with this incredible key, this incredible legend that can serve as a reference point for all the forms that are going to come. Now, if you think about, and this is a very common reaction to this method or people trying to paint in this way, you can get very frustrated and you can think, my God, I can't paint this form right now that I'm on because I don't know what this over here is going to be, and so I don't really know what choice I ought to make in terms of tone. And I get it, and that's a reasonable concern, and we're going to kind of come back to that. But if you look at it another way, if you really commit to this little area, and you really focus on painting each one of these forms as correctly as you possibly can, imagining the areas that you haven't painted yet, which gets easier the more you paint like this, then you can really create a set of relationships from which you can extrapolate out from for all the next areas. Now, it's possible, obviously, you might make mistakes. That's why I said early on, I do have to come back and revise, but I try. I try to finish as I go. And by painting this eye the way that I painted it, for better or for worse, I can look here and I can be like, okay, when I get to that forehead, that has to be lighter here than any one of those values here. Now, it's helpful for me to be mindful of that when I paint the eye, so I don't paint that value or that value too light. And again, you get better at that. But I can make decisions about the relationships there, even up here, elsewhere, throughout the painting, based on the set of relationships there. I can even use differences to make similar judgments. This is a little bit redder than what I painted there on that eyelid, so let me mix the eyelid again, make it a little bit redder, and paint it there. Essentially what I'm saying is, I have encoded in this small little area that I really committed to something I can reference and build out from in all the new areas. Now, of course, there might be shortcomings here, so I want to be sort of critical and aware of problems I might have. Maybe you painted it and your contrast is too high, so you pop the light on the brow too bright, and you start to see that the more you paint on it. Okay, fine. That, might invite you back into that area to correct now, maybe later. That really depends situationally. That's something I talk a lot about with my students in my online classes. But whatever the case is, you can become aware of problems in previous areas you painted and adjust in the new area that you're painting if you're not going to go back in that moment and correct those previous problems. Sort of a convoluted sentence, but the basic idea that I'm trying to communicate here is if you really commit to an area, paint it as best as you can in that moment, at that point in your life, your painting journey, then you will really create something that creates a nice legend or key for you to extrapolate out from and paint other areas. And you kind of compare that to the idea of, hey, maybe I should throw this in real quick, or maybe I should paint all over here real quick so that I know what needs to happen in this area that I'm confused about. Well, the question really becomes, if you start to mass in this other area, or you jump over here and throw this in, are you really putting in something that's that useful? How correct is this thing that you're just throwing down? And if you're not just throwing it down, if you're going in and painting this new area because you're frustrated here and you're painting it to a high finish, you're essentially still doing this same process. You're just leaving behind a lot of loose ends. You're just sort of giving up and going to this area. You'll probably do that again in that new area, give up on it and say, oh, I got to go over here now. And you'll kind of do that, but you'll do it at like 30%, 40%. Then you just have a lot of messes and you don't have any particular area that's as resolved as you can resolve it. And so it really kind of limits the extent to which you take this particular painting. Does that have to be true? No. Could you prove me wrong? Absolutely. But nevertheless, this is my thought process. Let me make this as best as I possibly can, and then I can use that to make the next form as best as it possibly can, or as good as I possibly can. And then with that sort of mentality, I'm constantly pushing not only that painting further, I'm pushing my skill further. And I actually have this weird thing, and it might seem, I wouldn't say counterintuitive, but it might seem counterproductive, where I want my next form in that painting to be better than the previous form, so that when I look back at that first area I painted, I'm like, oh, that looks awful because these new forms are better. Now, that is part of what leads me back to that revision stage later on, but it's really what keeps me, hopefully, marginally diminishing returns, get better over time, because every time I paint anything in my painting, I want it to be better than not only everything I've painted in the past, but everything I painted previously on that painting. I'm always trying to get better, even if being better is like this little tiny nuance in a little area, and there's always room for that. I was just, quick aside, I don't know if this fits into the video or not. I just saw one of my favorite Bouguereau paintings in real life at a museum yesterday. And it's like so subtle, so easy to take for granted. But the way he interlocked structure on any part of the face was so nuanced, so profound, so accurate structurally in terms of light effect on form. Everything was perfectly consistent. Everything had like a little earmark for how it fit together, not in an arbitrary soft way. Easy to kind of sort of dismiss an area as, oh, that looks blended. No, everything was meaningfully interconnected, particularly in a very structural way. And so I think, God, there's always room to improve these things, even if they're lost on the vast majority of people that are going to look at your work. Even if most of what you do is to make a painting or a post to put on social media where it's this big and people can't even see those things that matter to you, you're doing it. You're putting that extra 20, 30 minutes into an area, and trying to find those things. And maybe someday somebody will see your painting in real life and they'll see what you were trying to do with your time. And what I really like about this process is it sets me up, just the mentality of working this way, and also the time you give yourself, which is kind of indefinite in any area, to find that stuff, to push yourself. That is very special. And I'm not saying it's not in other methods, because it's possible I haven't lived with other methods enough to know where that comes out, where you can sort of squeeze that out of that particular process. But I know it's in this one. And I know that, look, there are many days where I just, my brain's not online and I'm just going through the motions. But there are days where I'm searching and I'm looking. And this method for me, gives me a path to keep growing. And that's actually an answer to a different question, which is one I get on social media, which is, don't I get bored painting the same thing over and over again? And I actually don't in any way get bored, because what I've just described is how I look at it. So it might just be another eye to whoever passes by. And I'm not insulted, I don't care. I'm actually more annoyed by artists that are annoyed by what people say to them than I am actually by those comments themselves. And while this really sincerely might be an advantage of this process, it is also a downside to this process. All of us probably on some level feel a certain anxiety at certain times, painting like this, not knowing for sure what other things ought to be. It would be nice if we could paint the whole thing, everything, at a high level, at a high finish like that. If only there were a device, it had like a glass that would take in light, sort of like an eye, and sort of put it on some kind of material. If only there were some kind of thing where we could get an image instantly. But alas, we must paint from photo references. Alas, we must paint these things and sort of slowly work through different things and solve problems in a reasonable way where we can manage them with our human brain. So let's talk about how to deal with that anxiety of not knowing what something should be, or what the color ought to be, or the value ought to be in the area you're painting without that context. And that feeling that you might have as you're painting and feeling confused and feeling stressed and feeling like you don't know what else to do to make that area work, that always seems to lead us to jump to another area too soon. But try to resist that pull, because very often it just leads you into a series of unfortunate events. And you want to sort of maintain that discipline if you do choose to work this way. And so one of those offsets to this problem is just that discipline. Another thing that comes out of experience, and it comes out of the experience of painting in general, but painting also specifically in this technique, is you get better and better at anticipating areas that you haven't painted yet. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but as I paint her right now, this is portrait number 7023 for me in this method. You start to sort of anticipate outcomes. You can also anticipate by just simply looking at your model and just making an analysis and being like, that forehead looks brighter than the cheek, or that cheek to our left looks darker than the cheek to our right. You can make it more conceptual by saying the cheek to our left is darker because the light is coming from the right. Whatever it is, you can have an explanation that is both visual and conceptual about the space, about the light, about the form. Now, actual literal things you can do. There's a few of them. Maybe a couple, maybe a few. Not sure. Haven't counted them yet. But one would be a color study. It's often called a poster study in the world from which I have emerged, like a virus. It's called a poster study because you're essentially posterizing the colors, the values, and making them very abstract, like large chunks. And that is a very specific taught offset to the problems inherent in this method. So when I was studying, and the person I studied with, who they studied with, this goes back quite a while, poster studies were sort of common practice. And here's some footage of me doing some poster studies for various paintings. I didn't do it for this one because I didn't plan ahead. But a poster study is a way to very specifically install a stage in this process wherein you do a study of the large relationships. And two things come out of doing this poster study, two important things. One, if the study turns out well, and you literally have a study that you can reference and even mix color off of as you go through your painting. So you have a chunk of color, or maybe 2 or 3 colors that are the forehead, a couple that are the cheeks and the eye socket area and the chin, so on and so forth. And you can specifically mix off of those. Another advantage is that by doing the poster study, by doing this color study, you now have experience looking at and thinking about these large relationships. It's just the experience of having done it influences decisions I make. So not only do I have the experience of having painted 7,049? I don't know the number, I made it up. But having painted a bunch of foreheads, a bunch of noses, a bunch of eyes, 2 times as many eyes very often than foreheads. And I have that experience, but I also have the immediate experience that's directly related to this pose, this lighting, of having abstracted and posterized that forehead, that cheek. Another offset to that inherent problem is adding little keys, little notes in the painting that anticipate a future value or color relationship that is going to emerge. And it's sort of a preventative measure for you in that tendency to jump ahead and mask something in because you feel you need it. Like, I can't paint this eye because I don't know what the hair is, or I don't know what the lower face is. Now again, that poster study, that color study I just mentioned, that's going to be a big, big help in that regard if you sort of encounter that kind of thing. And it's never too late, by the way, for that color study. You could be this far into it, halfway through it, 3/4 of the way through it. You could be 9/10 of it. You could actually probably be 99/100ths the way through it. And it still is okay to stop and do that color study if you need it. But keys, little color keys can really help. And let me demonstrate that for you real quick. So let's say I'm painting this eye, and let's say I have a lot of anxiety, which I don't. I'm really calm. I'm like 0 heart rate calm right now. I'm borderline dead right now. But let's pretend I'm really nervous and I don't know what values I'm going to do. And I'm like, my God, that hair is going to be so dark. And look at that hair down there by that cheek on the other side. It's so dark. It's so dark. What am I going to do? And I might even think, well, gosh, I don't know what's bright. The eyeball that I'm supposed to be painting is actually really bright, and I'm not painting it bright. So that's actually just a problem. I can't solve for Scott's ineptitudes right now. So let's just pretend they don't exist. That's what I do every day. Okay. So a key would be this. That hair is going to be really dark, and I feel like having that in would be helpful. My impulse is to mass it all in and mass this in and just blob in a lot of paint. Don't do that. Do this, because it's a lot easier to correct this later on, or cover it up, I should say, later on. I'm just going to make my best guess. Raw umber and ivory black. That's a dark value, and I'm going to put in a little note right here. It doesn't take up a lot of area. Later on when that's dry and I do want to paint that, if I'm worried about that being a little bit of a bevel in the paint, I take the tip of the palette knife, I scrape it down. It's like it never happened. So I do a little key there. I could do the same on the forehead, key a little, or put a little note there that's a little bit lighter on the ball of the nose if I want to really, let's say, make a color relationship that's nuanced and I'm worried about the red pitch on those red of the lips. This might come into play if I wanted to paint the nose a little bit red or the cheeks a little bit red, but I didn't want to go too far and max out my chroma, my saturation. Before putting in those lips, I might put a little key just like that of those lips right there. I'm not really going to put that in right now because I don't want to have them everywhere on this painting, but you can see how that looks in practice, and you could do the same thing on the lips. I would say I'd rather you do 15 of these than mass in a big blob for that hair, which is going to make it so much harder later on. And the big blob almost always looks bad. And when things look bad around your painting, I find it harder to get excited about it. It's harder to remain confident and clear and make good decisions. So notes are a great way to offset this issue of painting little areas at once. So between the color studies, between adding these notes, and just getting the experience to where you can anticipate relationships in the future because you've painted 7,000 foreheads, that helps too. So keep painting. So the last thing I want to talk about is how you separate out the concepts, the ideas I think about, what I use to sort of interpret what I'm looking at and rebuild it with paint on my canvas, to separate out those ideas from the process itself. Now, before I do that, I should say that the process is sort of designed to deal with some of these issues in an optimal way, meaning the overall process where I do the drawing on paper, transfer it, underpaint, do that color study or poster study that I talked about. But then when I paint that brow form or that eyelid, or let's say a nostril or mouth, any one of those things has so many different effects happening. It's all form in space interacting with a light source or multiple light sources, reflected light sources, ambient light. The material itself could be somewhat glossy, could be more matte than glossy. You have to sort of parse those things out. I have a recent video on highlights. It could be translucent. It could be very translucent. It could be transparent. It could have Fresnel or Fresnel effects, where an effect becomes more prominent as a form turns away from you, the viewer. And all of these things will have implications on the value. It will have implications or outcomes with the color, the chroma. Translucency will have light transmit through, and you'll get a higher chroma, maybe near a terminator. Maybe you'll get a field of subsurface scattering. These are all ideas, right? This is just a smattering of various ideas, examples of the kinds of things I talk about in my videos. And the process that you see me do here gives me the opportunity to explore those things in discrete little areas and investigate them and build those relationships and have a lot of fun doing it, right? I enjoy that so much, essentially what I said earlier. We're kind of going back to the benefits of the working method. But those are the ideas I like exploring, and I will admit that this process is set up well to give you the opportunity to slowly investigate and respond to those things in turn. However, if you do want to work in a more general way, or if you do work in a more general way, you can still watch the videos and the ideas, the notions I might present about how light transmits through form. You just apply that at whatever stage is appropriate. So if you work general to specific and you can't include that in the painting yet because you don't have enough information down and you're relating things in a larger way, just keep it in mind and find the part of your process where it makes sense to include that particular nuance and see how far you can get with the ideas plugged into your working method. A painting I'm working on right now, which is largely painted in the method you see me paint this painting and everything else, I encountered a forehead that had a lot of subforms, a lot of different effects, and I actually kind of switched from this mode that you see me doing now, where I painted the eyes in a very sequential way. When I got to the forehead, I kind of had to switch to a more general to a specific or larger form idea. It was still very form-oriented. I was sculpting that overall forehead, but I had to do it in a large way. I had to overlook a lot of the subforms, and I had to kind of paint around the highlight and paint that diffuse form first so that I could get some real traction, so I could get some of those larger relationships. But the way I approach that other mode is still very much based on these concepts. So again, the ideas, they're separate. You can think about them when you watch my videos. If you watch them, you can take those concepts and those ideas and think about where they might fit in to your process. Thank you for checking out this video. If you like my content and you want to see more tutorials that go even more in depth, check me out at patreon.com/ScottWaddell, and you can really support this channel and help me make more of these videos and more videos on Patreon. There's like thousands, maybe hundreds, thousands of hours. I don't know, it's a lot. Don't hold me to that, but it's a lot of content. And if you don't like subscriptions, but you still want more tutorials from me, you can go to my website, that's scottwaddellfineart.com, and you can check out some downloadable tutorials. Some of them are very serious, but go into a lot of depth. And then some of them are more like this. So you get a whole smattering of art videos and art instruction. And if you're so inclined, you can check out my online classes where you can study one-on-one with me. And I talk just like this, only more calm, very serious. I talk like this. This is how I teach. I teach like this. Your form's not very good. Why is your form not good? Paint better form. There you go. That's it. Really good work. Have a good day.